Welcome to the Climate Finance Podcast. My name is Jonas, and this podcast aims to mainstream climate finance by interviewing high level investors, researchers, and policymakers who have made significant contributions to the climate finance space. Please note that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. Enjoy the episode. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Climate Finance Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Gernot Wagner. Gernot Wagner is a climate economist at Columbia Business School. He is the author of Geoengineering, The Gamble, published in 2021, Climate Shock, The Economic Consequences of a Hotter Planet, published in 2016, along with Dr. Martin Weitzman, and But Will the Planet Notice How Smart Economics Can Save the World, published in 2012. Previously, he was a professor at NYU and a founding co-director of Harvard University's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. He started off his career as a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group and was a lead senior economist at the Environmental Defense Fund. Dr. Wagner received his master's degree in economics from Stanford University and his bachelor's and Ph.D. from Harvard University. So welcome, Professor. How's it going in New York?
It is hot, but otherwise all good. Good to be here. Hi.
It's also hot in Norway. So while preparing for this interview, found your background to be very interesting. If you could take us back to 1998 when you were starting off your undergrad and how you evolved until 2007 until you finished off your PhD. I would be particularly interested in your influences because I saw that you wrote your thesis related to green accounting, and one of, let's say, the several economists that inspired you, Martin Weitzman, the first major contribution that you wrote in this article, A Gift Keeps on Giving, was green national accounting.
Well spotted. So this brings me way back, but actually it was, as I've told this story a couple of times, I hope I'm getting the date right now. So it was a Thursday, September 17th, 1998. I'm pretty sure it was a Thursday. So I'm pretty sure I'm getting a weekday right. But I went to Marty Weitzman's office hours, right? I was 18. He was basically the first professor I ever met. And that was first week freshman year in college. And I basically showed up and said, well, you're an environmental economist. I would like to be like you one day. How do you do this? What do you do? And so actually the funny story there, so it wasn't green accounting. What he did, he sat me down and instead of 15 minutes, right? Usually when you're sort of as a freshman, you're in college, you meet a prof, right? It's sort of like, take some math, take some intro econ, right? Don't do drugs, and we'll see each other again, right? In a few years. And it was like 45 minutes or so in his office. And he sat me down with this yellow legal pad and the number 2 pencil. It's sort of his characteristic tools of the trade. And he walked me through how research is done by using prices versus quantities as sort of this example, right? And like the whole story about how it started out as being about Soviet economics versus US market economy. And then his paper got rejected, right? It's called research for a reason. You search, and you search again. And then he rewrote it. It's prices versus quantities of the environmental sense, environmental regulation, and how that paper, published in 1974, set him out in the direction of becoming an environmental economist. Okay, I can't claim I understood most of what was happening to me while I was sitting there, like having him rederive some equations in front of my eyes. But yeah, that was fascinating to watch. And well, it certainly convinced me that this was the right thing to do, that what I wanted to do, and that I wanted to study economics and environmental science and so on. And actually, I think it might have been the same week or the week after that I then met Dale Jorgensen. Basically, same idea, right? So, dear professor, do you have 10 minutes for me? I would love to, be you one day, kind of thing. And he had just finished working on a National Academy study called Nature's Numbers at the time, which was basically a US National Academy study on green accounting. And there was this appendix, I still remember, Appendix A, on the next obvious step is to create US timber accounts. And I can tell you, so I don't know whether it was sort of along the lines of, oh yeah, this is a really fascinating topic, you should be working on this, or whether it was a way of him saying, here's something easy for you to do, go away, and, when you're done, come again, and it's going to take you 4 years, so, I will see you again. So I went away with this and decided more or less that, yeah, this timber accounts thing, creating, like, basically counting trees, standing timber, and writing a value of the standing timber. Well, short version, it turned into my undergraduate thesis. So he ended up hiring me. Dale Jorgensen ended up hiring me as an RA, research assistant, that first summer after my freshman year in college. And I remember research back then. So it wasn't that long ago, but yeah, the way to do this basically was to write to 50 US Forest Service state agencies, ask them to ship the printed reports of their state level timber accounts, and then type it into Excel. That's literally what I did that summer of my freshman year, and basically create this database that then eventually I used for some very simple math in the end, but deriving US timber accounts for my undergrad thesis 3 years later in 2000.
And then you did your PhD eventually, right?
Yes. So I left Harvard. I was supposed to get my PhD at Stanford. But actually, okay, the full version I didn't tell you what happened on September 17th, 1998. I also turned out later was in the same room as my soon-to-be girlfriend, now spouse of 21 years. So I met Thierry that a couple months later, but we figured out later that we were in the same room together for the first time. And it turns out that room was when Kofi Annan gave a speech. So our 12-year-old, of course, now is called Annan. But why is it relevant for Stanford? So I was supposed to get my PhD at Stanford, but Siri got into medical school back in Boston. So my very first meeting at Stanford with Larry Goulder at Stanford was, thank you for accepting me and getting me here. I will leave with a master's after a year and reapply for a PhD back in Boston, in Cambridge, which is what I did. So I left Stanford with a master's and did my PhD back at Harvard. Started a year after and finished in 2007. Graduated in 2007 with my PhD.
Awesome. So you graduated around the let's say the beginning of the global financial crisis, and you spent a year at
Not
BCG.
awesome, but yes, exactly. So, well, actually, yes, very lucky, right? Okay, so I mean, here's a broader life lesson as so often, right? That most of life is just dumb luck, right? So yes, I graduated in 07. And actually, so you mentioned BCG as my first job. So actually, my very first job was I wrote for the editorial board of the Financial Times on a fellowship, right? So I knew that there was only a limited appointment. And I also knew more or less, or I'd like to think that I knew, but that I would be able to join EDF soon thereafter. So basically, in the 10 months between Financial Times and EDF, I spent 10 months at BCG, Boston Consulting Group, which was a very useful sort of a year. Basically, frankly, focused on climate and energy, and right. So this was sort of very early days for these consultancies when they started to basically hire PhDs and started to specialize in specific topics. And yeah, I was sort of the carbon markets person on some fairly interesting cases on, I guess, three different continents, working on carbon market design, clean energy investments, and sort of early days. But yes, that was 2007, 2008. And right about then, right, like had I graduated a year later, I don't think I would have gotten a job at BCG, right, or any job for that matter, outside academia. And so 2008, I joined EDF, and then I spent almost a decade, 8 years or 8.5 years at EDF.
What's interesting is when you joined the EDF, that's when the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol started. And I can see several of your publications on Google Scholar are related to Kyoto or carbon finance or climate finance or carbon tax and carbon and trade, cap and trade. Sorry. So how did your ideas evolve during the first few years at EDF?
Oh, yeah. So actually, maybe again, not to make it too personal, but the full story there is so my boss at EDF was Nat Cohen, who was also the teaching fellow. So he was a PhD student at Harvard in 1998 when I was joined for college. So he was a teaching fellow in my first environmental economics class. Rob Stavins was the professor, Nat Cohen, the assistant teaching fellow. And he hired me to EDF, actually with a very specific purpose. So at the time was a big Obama-era climate policy push here in the US, right? Waxman Markey, cap and trade, emissions trading. So my first focus, the first year and a half, 2 years at EDF was largely domestic climate policy. And that law passed the House of Representatives June 26, 2009, when it passed the House. It fizzled in the Senate, didn't go anywhere. Big failure at the end, which was when I shifted most of my own attention from U.S. domestic policy, actually in two directions. On the one hand, U.S. state level, on the one hand, as opposed to federal level, and international. So actually, maybe one of the sort of milestones in those years was it came a few years later. The publication came a few years later, but I then ended up joining a team of co-authors. There were 6 of us total who co-wrote the World Bank's emissions trading handbook. And actually, in many ways, that's it's still a fairly relevant publication as far as these things go. And actually, as far as these sort of World Bank documents go, right? There's always sort of this tail end where some are wildly popular, and many of these working papers have a few dozen downloads. In this case, it was translated into several languages, including Chinese, and actually, including the first couple languages were Ukrainian and Turkish. Because essentially, right, the EU had its emissions trading system, and if you had ambition to become a member of the European Union, which Ukraine and Turkey had at the time, and even a prospect of that happening, then you needed to implement a cap and trade system, right? So in some sense, this emissions trading handbook was sort of aimed at middle-level bureaucrats in, I guess in this case, Istanbul and in Kiev, to implement a cap and trade system. And Chinese was another language it was translated in. So that meant working fairly actively with NDRC. So NRDC is the other US environmental group, NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission in China, charged with implementing these regional cap and trade trials, and by now a national system. So yeah, there was a lot of sort of bilateral direct engagement in helping on the sidelines. I can't claim I had a core role in implementing the Chinese cap and trade system, but sort of helping on the sidelines with sort of specific design elements of that cap and trade program.
We'll discuss China later on, but if we can take a step back, before you published the Emissions Trading in Practice Guide, you published a book, But Will the Planet Notice? And I'd like to know what was your impetus for that. You try to discuss how we shouldn't focus as much as we do on individual action and more on smart economics and market-based incentives. So how did you come out to write that book?
I mean, frankly, it was more or less an English translation of an economics textbook. So yes, that was my first English book. I wrote a German one before, but let's not talk about that. So it was basically an accessible guide to how to think about it's sometimes misguided economics, right? Misguided market forces being the problem, and guiding market forces, getting the economics right, being the solution to climate change, right? And so the title, and in some sense the introduction, sort of the how to channel. I mean, how I spoke about the book at the time was very much as a sort of juxtaposition to individual action will do it, right? Will solve climate change, right? If we all just got together and did more of X, we would solve this. And actually, at the time, so my very first New York Times op-ed at the time was basically a serialization of the book, or an 800-word version of the book's main argument. And the title of the op-ed was "Going Green and Getting Nowhere," and it was basically about. It's still relevant today, unfortunately, frankly, but how voluntary action and, frankly, voluntary offsets just won't do. So the story I told in the op-ed and the book was on voluntary carbon offset that airlines offer, right? And sort of the thought experiment, in some sense, or the question, like, why would an airline offer passengers to buy offsets? Right? Forest offsets, cheap offsets, not to make anyone feel bad about flying, right? But to make them feel good about flying and do more of it, right? I mean, that's, of course, right? Duh, right? That's just sort of economics 101. And yeah, thinking through that out loud and basically saying, look, this is the most compelling argument I have seen myself, actually, to this date, right? Why? Well, voluntary action along these lines just can't work, right? Because, well, why would an airline, American Airlines, United, or whoever, right? Basically, right? First, they make sure you pay for the ticket. They make sure that happens, right? And then they offer you the chance to spend another $10 to offset the emissions that your flight will have caused. And well, that just cannot be the solution, right? Regardless of whether offsets are good or bad in general, and whether forest carbon offsets are credible and so on, and whether it's worth it to preserve trees, yes, it is, of course, and we need to find intelligent ways to doing that. And carbon markets may well play a real role, but volunteerism just can't be the answer. I think it might be a step backwards, right? It basically makes you feel good about your action, even though the offset itself might be worthless, right? That's a real problem. But then primarily it encourages you to fly more. And of course, that's where economics comes in, right? And thinking through what are the Econ 101 implications or Econ 101 reasons why airlines offer those offsets, and what is the real solution?
I'd like to move on to your second book, Climate Shocks, that you wrote with Marty Weitzman. This came around the end of your period at EDF, but you also, in that book, which was focused on climate sensitivity and fat tails, you also mentioned solar geoengineering. And I think that paved the way to becoming a co-founding director of the Solar Geoengineering Research Program. So could you tell us about how that evolved?
So first of all, consider me impressed. I mean, you know my CV better than I do. So yes, I mean, yes, exactly, right? So we wrote it, I guess. Okay, so this first book came out, Will the Planet Notice? And okay, this now sounds maybe funny or arrogant for that matter, but Marty Weitzman, who I did know since my freshman year in college, and he spent time working together during my PhD, but we never co-authored anything, or to be frank, Marty Weitzman wasn't known for co-authoring papers or anything. Like there's a couple throughout his career, including one, by the way, in Russian. So he taught himself Russian and co-authored a paper with a Russian economist in Russian. So yes, impressive. So it turned out he picked up my first book, and liked it, and basically called me up and said, okay, so I'm thinking about trying to find a bigger audience for this idea where I, Marty, think I'm onto something here with this fat tails argument, and I'd like to find a better way to tell this story. And so that was like 2013 or so, right? So these books take a long time to from start to finish. So maybe 2012, 2013 when we first had first conversations, and it came out in 2015, right? So it took us a year or so to write it, and another year to come out. And yes, that book was, it's sort of split in two parts. The first half, more or less, is the fat tails story, right? Where, in some sense, the short version is what we know about climate change is bad enough. The things we don't know are potentially much, much worse. And the example of climate sensitivity, right? Just like it's basically the uncertainty only goes one way, and not the good way, right? Sort of it's the bad end of the tail of the distribution. And that was half the book. And yes, the other half, and in some sense, right, to basically complement the story about how it's the unknowns and the unknowables that might drive the final outcome, well, here's an introduction to geoengineering, right? Solar geoengineering, solar radiation management. And so I wrote that with Marty, who had also thought in peer-reviewed articles about the implications of solar geoengineering and the free driver effect and so on. And actually the origin there was actually the word free driver. So Marty and I first wrote this in a foreign policy article. I think the title was Playing God. And the 2,000 words or so, or 1,200 words, were about sort of incredible economics of solar geoengineering, which I think now this incredible economics actually is a title I just stole from Scott Barrett, I believe. He wrote a paper called The Incredible Economics of Geoengineering. And we made this sort of free driver point and so on, which then Marty wrote up formally in a model that ended up as the second half of the book. And yes, right, it led to actually somebody else, David Keith, basically calling me up and saying, "Oh, hey, this is interesting. Are you by any chance interested in sort of jumping ship from EDF, coming back to Harvard and starting this research program?" And yes, actually, the story there, which I'm not sure I've ever told publicly, frankly, but it was the afternoon of the signing of the Paris Agreement. Literally, the Saturday afternoon, David was in my living room in Cambridge. So we'd already lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. And David and I shook hands and basically said, yes, let's do this. Let's start this research program. That was, December, early December, end of November, early December, I think, 2015. So I was still at EDF and I was there for another 6 months or so. But then I joined David at Harvard to start this research program.
I'd be interested to know what was your research progress during your time at Harvard on this research program, but also about your next book, Geoengineering the Gamble. There were three interesting concepts. You already mentioned one, free driver effect, but some of the listeners or some people that haven't read your book yet may confuse it with the free rider effect because it sounds a bit similar. And then you also have another interesting term, green moral hazards, which I think that would also be interesting to the listeners. If I can end my question on this, is that you started off a research program, but at the end of a book, you recommend that we need more research, especially more research funding, and then also deployment funding. So if you could touch on that, please.
Sure, yeah. So, well, I thought it's fair to say that Harvard's program was basically the first university-based research program that sort of went beyond a single professor, right? Like, like lots of things call themselves research program, but often it's basically, a prof and some funding and a few grad students, right? So in this case, the point was in many ways to establish a much broader research program that goes across disciplines, across faculties, still, at Harvard, so within Harvard, but to basically establish this research program that explores the risks, the potential benefits, the net benefits, if you will, the risk trade-offs, and yes, other aspects like the moral hazard of even talking about solar geoengineering, right? So what is moral hazard in this case, right? So as economists, right, we all know what moral hazard is, right? It's sort of this ever-present idea. It works for health insurance. It works for seatbelts. It works for condoms and IUDs, right? It's any kind of technofix comes with a moral hazard attached. So does geoengineering, both carbon geoengineering, right, carbon removal, and maybe especially also solar geoengineering. Actually, in that case, I teamed up with a historian, David Sissemir, to write sort of this 10, 12,000 word historical essay on green moral hazards, where we go through the history of the US environmental movement and, in some sense, explain it as being defined by moral hazard style thinking, right? Nuclear power, of course, and lots of examples like this. Solar geoengineering ultimately being one, or maybe right, like really a very prominent example of this concept. Actually, that ended up, it was sort of a peer-reviewed historical essay on the one hand, and a slightly more English version, if you will, with fewer footnotes, fewer citations, maybe ended up as a book chapter in Geoengineering the Gamble. And frankly, I would still say this to this day, and I've not since then done some more research on this topic, sort of empirical research, that moral hazard is in many ways the primary reason, not the only one, definitely not the only one, but maybe the primary reason why solar geoengineering has this somewhat unique role within the climate research community on the one hand, and broader society, because it's moral hazard is real. Moral hazard is a problem. It really is. And fear of moral hazard has frankly led to lots of self-censorship within the scientific community, in part for good reason, and I would argue in part for very bad reason, because actually it is possible to turn this moral hazard idea on its head. And when I say that, there's actually the sort of very first revealed preference experiment of this sort was led by Christine Merck, a German social scientist at the Kiel Institute, who did this research in, I think, 2016 is when the paper came out. 600 Germans, 200 of them, three groups, and 200 of them were told about solar geoengineering. And those 200 Germans told about solar geoengineering were more likely to spend more of their own money on carbon offsets. Okay, so here's the offsets again, right? And now we can sort of argue why offsets may not be the right solution or the right instrument for that matter. But, they're a pretty good proxy for willingness to spend on cutting one's own carbon footprint, and sort of a realistic way to test in a lab, basically, on a revealed preference experiment. Christina and co-authors did that. And now actually since then I've worked with her on a much, much larger scale, instead of N of 600, N of 200,000, sort of an online revealed preference experiment along these lines. And frankly, one of the conclusions is that, yes, under extreme circumstances, it is possible to get to moral hazard, right? To get to this idea that when you tell people about solar geoengineering as this beautiful techno fix that will just fix it all, that you get people to basically say, oh, cool, I don't need to mitigate, right? We don't need to mitigate. We can ease off climate policy more broadly. Solar geoengineering will just fix it. But frankly, that's a really extreme case. And it's very difficult to sort of replicate in our data. So much more realistic is the scenario of basically saying, look, if you talk about solar geoengineering in a reasonable, sensible way, what you will get as a result is a fairly reasonable, sensible response, which is, yeah, we should look at it, we should research it, but frankly, we also need climate policy. It can only be part of, and when I say we also need climate policy, right, we need to cut emissions primarily, we need to adapt, we need to do other things that go well beyond, just this one simple technical fix. Yes, right. So I only talked about free driver before, which of course only makes sense in the context of a free rider effect. So free rider is basically what economists often call the root cause of climate change, right? So we are all free riders here, all 8 billion of us, right? In the sense that none of us individually, even if we could and we can't, would be motivated to basically solve climate change for the rest of us, because we're all free riders. Now, frankly, there have been by now written some very cogent critiques written that actually the core of the climate problem goes well beyond this sort of simplistic idea of a free rider concept. But yeah, sort of this global commons problem, climate is a global commons problem, and we are all free riders here. Why free riders? Well, because the benefits of acting accrue to everybody, all 8 billion of us, whereas the costs of your own action are yours, right? Okay, solar geoengineering in many ways turns this logic on its head. It is cheap, it is fast, it's also imperfect. It's not a perfect solution to climate change. It's not, it can't be, must not be. That's cutting emissions. But the cheap and the fast push it in the opposite direction, where in many ways the task here is not to motivate more people to do more, as in cut emissions, but if anything, it's to stop people from doing too much, too soon, stupidly. Right, and that's that's basically right. Yeah, turning this global commons problem, the free rider problem, on its head. And well, what's the opposite of free rider? It's free driver. I guess technically it's costly driver, but it's not costly. It's free, so free driver. And yeah, it's basically this idea that it's so cheap and it works so fast, so quickly, and cheap in the narrow engineering sense of the costs. That the name of the game, the task here is to channel that sort of these desires, these characteristics in the right direction. And frankly, this is where this call for research comes in, right? So we just don't know enough to frankly vote today whether we should be solar geoengineering the planet. I mean, frankly, if you were to ask me today, I would say no, we don't know enough, right? We don't. We need to do the research. We might want to have actually quite literally a moratorium on deployment, right, with the expressed permission to do research under that threshold. And frankly, that's the grand conclusion of this book, Geoengineering the Gamble, right? Like it's such a gamble. We've got to do the work. We've got to do the research. And no, the Harvard research program, right, did not have all the answers, right? Did not come up with all the answers. Yeah, we do need more research, and actually in an amazing way. So this is how this is going. So actually, a couple of weeks ago, by now, the White House, Office of Science and Technology Policy, came up with a U.S. federal research guidelines. And by the way, the EU, the European Commission, is working on them, and so on. But basically, the task here is to, fund and channel this research in the right direction to explore the potential benefits, and yes, of course, also the risks, the efficacy, and so on of solar geoengineering.
Nice. And could you give us, you mentioned some numbers of how much it would cost to do the research and deployment. Could you tell us briefly?
Well, okay, so in the book, sort of the round numbers, we can sort of order of magnitude, sort of, $10 million-ish, tens of millions of dollars to do, for a sensible research program. So by comparison, the Harvard program, so we raised initially $12 million. It ended up with $16 million of funding total, not every year, total. And the call for a federal research program, U.S. federal research program, is basically around 5, 10 million, 15 million per year, at least initially. Now, that's for research, right? Now, solar geoengineering, right? Why do I call it cheap? Well, I call it cheap, and many others call it cheap in the narrow engineering sense, because the narrow engineering calculation basically says that it would cost, single-digit billions of dollars. Let's round up and call it $10 billion per year, at least initially, to literally launch a potentially global deployment program of solar geoengineering. Ideally, not going from 0 to 100 immediately, right? So sort of a slowly ramped up deployment scenario where the investment necessary, the costs are order of magnitude these $10 billion-ish per year. So that's not free, right? I certainly couldn't find. I'd have to sell a couple more books to be able to do this. And by the way, nobody should want to do this themselves, right? That's exactly where lots of this research needs to go, right? How do you channel these characteristics in the right direction? And these single-digit billions of dollars, $10 billion or so, ought to be compared to the potential benefits, which are in fact orders of magnitude more. And again, no, not a perfect solution, plenty of risks and so on, even though, right, if there is this technology that potentially helps stabilize global average temperatures, and by the way, not ocean acidification, not other negative effects of climate change, right? Again, highly imperfect, but just the net benefits of keeping global average temperatures from rising further, well, they are in fact vast, right? So this is, the bread and butter of climate economics is calculating the benefits or the costs of unmitigated climate change. And they're not $10 billion a year, they're trillions of dollars a year globally, right? Many trillions of dollars a year globally. And that's the comparison here. That's the initial calculation that would lead you to believe, it makes sense to do more research on this topic because, look, the net benefits vastly outweigh the costs, which in many ways also points to a benefit cost calculation simply not being the right criterion, right? It's all about risk trade-offs. It's about the risks of unmitigated climate change and the risks of potentially thinking about deploying this technology.
Thank you. I would like to move on now from focusing on, let's say, your thought leadership publications on your website. I mean, I'll recommend any of the listeners to check out Wagner.com, if I'm not mistaken.
That's the one, yes.
Yeah,
and I'm somehow G Wagner everywhere on the internet. So it's G Wagner at Columbia, gwagner.com. Yes, that's
okay.
where I live.
Yeah, so there are several interesting articles or article groupings that you have, and if you could touch on them very briefly. The first one is you've written a lot about the social cost of carbon and the true price of carbon. I'd like to hear your thoughts on carbon taxes, especially how oil and gas giants think about carbon taxation, which you've written about?
Okay, so maybe the quick version is, so first of all, carbon pricing, social cost of carbon, has very little to do with carbon tax, or I mean, has a lot to do with carbon tax ultimately, but is just not the same, right? So like that's sort of often a mistake that frankly lots of us economists often make, sometimes inadvertently, in sometimes sort of confusing the two and then taking it to the sort of political next step, right? Which is to say that I think it is like 3,000 plus of my closest friends signed this letter arguing for a $50 per ton of CO2 federal carbon tax, rising at the rate of, I think, $5 per year, in exchange for regulatory simplification in Washington, right? And I can tell you, actually, one of my big failings vis-a-vis Marty Weitzman was to not be able to convince him not to sign this letter. And I can tell you, for example, Bill Nordhaus, to his full credit, did not sign this letter. And in many ways, the sort of the climate economists closest to this kind of research, and especially closest to the policy conversations and the political economy, most of them also declined to sign this letter. Why? Well, you mentioned the oil and gas before. Plenty of oil and gas companies, Exxon maybe most prominently, who also support precisely this idea. $50 per ton of CO2 carbon tax in exchange for regulatory simplification. Okay, well, again, take a step back and think about why they will support this. Well, why do you support a $50 carbon tax on your own product? In order to avoid a higher carbon tax, carbon price on your product. And of course, that's exactly what's happening here, right? So, regulatory simplification for stationary source pollutants, that was the full wording here, is precisely basically saying, okay, let's get rid of all these costly regulations and replace them with a beautiful, simple federal carbon tax. And yeah, I mean, beautiful and simple sounds pretty good, sure. But of course, right, it's about the shadow price, it's about the full cost of policy in this case, relative to what the cost should be, right? So, yes, right, a lot of my research in this area is on pricing climate risk, making sense of the unknowns, the unknowables, and trying to quantify tipping points, for example, and translating it into this quantity called the social cost of carbon, right? What each ton of CO2 should and frankly does cost society, right? All 8 billion of us. But of course, the polluter doesn't pay. And frankly, well, I mean, actually, by now we know that the sort of the update of the Biden administration to the U.S. social cost of carbon, that the round central figure that everyone has talked about used to be $50. Now it's $200, right? And sure, right, if the social cost of carbon is $50 and we all believe that that's the right number, then, Exxon and, again, 3,000 of our closest friends signing this statement saying we should get rid of all of the regulation, just have $50, yeah, that might actually be a worthwhile trade, right? If $50 is the right number and you can get there by trading away some other things, then that trade might be worthwhile. Well, if the right number is $200, and there are actually lots of policies in place that are, akin to those $200, you don't want to trade those away for a carbon tax that's $50, much, much lower than what we now believe the social cost of carbon to be. Right? So, yes, it matters how high this number is. It matters a lot. Getting it right is important. I also should add immediately, there is no single such number, right? Lots of risks, lots of uncertainties. There's a large range, potential range for that social cost of carbon. You might call the $200 the lower bound, or a reasonable lower bound, a reasonable partial estimate for this social cost. And the more of the currently unquantified uncertainties we are able to quantify, the higher that number is going to be. In many ways, it can only go in that one direction. And then there are all the unquantifiables, all the unknowns and unknowables. And, they are too, right? Most of these climate risks, uncertainties, point in one and only one direction, which means the true number, the true cost of each ton of CO2 emitted is much, much higher still, potentially much, much higher still.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to net zero targets, but more specifically, what the response is in different geographic regions. I know you're very well versed in net zero targets. You wrote a case study with Bruce Usher, who I recently interviewed for the cost to achieve net zero. And he also talked about Exxon in his recent book. You've written a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act and its greenflationism or anti-inflationary effects. Could you touch on that? But also, what's the EU response to it, to the IO, which is also a very interesting dynamic.
Absolutely, it is. So actually, okay, so full credit on this one goes to Isabel Schnabel, by the way, who is this prominent German economist and a member of the European Central Bank's Executive Committee, who came up with this term, greenflation, fossilflation, or three terms, greenflation, fossilflation, and climateflation. Okay, what do they mean? Well, climateflation is basically, right, increase in prices because of unmitigated climate change, climate catastrophes leading to upward pressure on prices and explaining part of inflation. Inflation is, wait, if we all jump to renewable energy right now, well, renewable energy is going to be more expensive as a result if everyone wants it, right? Supply demand. That might drive inflation. And fossilflation, in many ways the big one here, right, is what's the component, the portion of inflation attributable to high fossil fuel prices, or fossil fuel prices in general, and fluctuation of these prices and so on. And actually, so obviously, in part due to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, right? So February 24th, 2022, last year. Actually, not just then. Actually, prices were pretty high before already, fossil fuel price. But then, yes, fossil fuel prices jumped even more so. And frankly, at the time, when you looked at inflation and the components of inflation, fossil fuel, fossil energy was at least half of inflation, right? So over half of inflationary pressures were due to high, surprisingly high fossil fuel prices, i.e. fossilflation, right? Well, hence the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, right? Sort of very aptly named, and in many ways the most ambitious climate policy ever passed in the US, focused on getting the US off fossil fuels with this fossilflation idea front and center, and by the way, also addressing greenflation front and center, right? In the sense that, yes, it takes subsidies on the clean, green, lean, mean energy front, right, to get us off fossil fuels, subsidize the alternative, and in part, well, very directly address fossilflation, and in part also directly address greenflation by basically saying, we need to increase the supply of low carbon, high efficiency alternatives to our fossil-based infrastructure, fossil-based economy. So yes, 3 cheers for the Inflation Reduction Act. And by the way, 3 cheers for all 3 laws: Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and Chips and Science Act, which put together, by some estimates, of something like $2 trillion, trillion with a T, worth of investments in the US economy on the clean energy front over the next decade. Okay, you asked about the European response, right? Well, the direct response at the time from many European politicians, understandably so, was to basically say, oh, wow, they are subsidizing their own industry. That is bad for us, right? This is sort of the beggar thy neighbor, right? So, and frankly, yeah, you could point in fall 2022, you could point to individual examples where Tesla was building a gigafactory in Berlin-Brandenburg, and they were, at the time, there was these stories about how they were rerouting equipment meant for the Berlin factory to a factory in the US, right? And sort of the Inflation Reduction Act is to blame. And you can't blame the European politician who basically looks at this example and looks at the headline and says, this is bad, right? So, cue von der Leyen and Macron and so on going to Washington and basically, telling Biden their side of the story, right? I think the bigger picture, the real answer in many ways is very different. And actually, I think the best analysis is actually a close colleague of mine here at Columbia, Connor Walsh, and a colleague of his at Yale, who wrote this paper. It's now out as a working paper called Clean Growth, where they look at spillovers, positive learning by doing spillovers across the planet, and where they frankly conclude fairly convincingly, very convincingly, that investments in US, just solely the Inflation Reduction Act, US clean energy investments with all these domestic provisions and so on, right? So subsidizing US domestic clean energy production leads to an increase in GDP in the US, yes, and not just during the 10-year period, but also after, and an increase in global GDP, and especially also when you dig more deeply into the numbers for Europe, for example, or any other jurisdiction, any other country, region that they have data for, increase in Europe's GDP because of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Why? Positive spillovers, right? So US learning by doing subsidies make not just US industry more productive, it increases productivity in Europe, for example. So Europe's GDP goes up because of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Or put differently, right, the message here to, frankly, European or any other policymaker is to say, first of all, right, don't complain. This is good for you too. And by the way, yeah, join in, right? Join this clean energy race very directly. Europe in many ways has this structural advantage that they are also pricing carbon in a big way. The emissions trading system and carbon taxes, other policies, which the US does not have at the federal level, right? So Europe has this advantage that they are already nudging pricing things in the right direction on the demand side. Well, dear Europe, also subsidize your own domestic clean energy industry. And right, there's often talk of sort of the race to the bottom and so on. Well, in this case, it's very much a race to the top, right? We know we need to price the negative externality and the positive learning by doing externality much, much more so, right? Price and subsidy. Okay, well, let's nudge each other toward ever higher, ever more optimal climate policy in the broadest sense possible. And yeah, that means Europeans should be brushing up on their English and writing thank you notes to US households, right? I used to talk about how Americans need to brush up on the German and write thank you notes to German households and Chinese households, by the way, for subsidizing the solar PV learning curve. Right? The Germans on the demand side, the Chinese on the supply side. Well, in this case, it's the inverse, right? So writing thank you notes to US households.
Thank you. You mentioned China, and I would like to hear your perspectives on both India and China. You mentioned China that you had previously worked with the NDRC, and they have a 2060 target, but India has a 2070 target, and you call both these countries the climate G2. So what's your take on these two countries? Yeah.
Interesting. Actually, okay, so maybe a bit of nuance there. So what this paper I think you're referring to is arguing that everybody else calls US and China the climate G2, right? Sort of the G2. I mean, there's plenty of Gs around, right? There's the G7 and there's the G0 world, according to Ian Bremmer, and there's the G20 and so
G. Wagner.
Exactly, right. And then there's the G2, right? And so we did this analysis that basically I'm still fairly convinced of the outcome here, that argues that it's not so much that China should be considered to be part of the G2, but that the counterweight to the US in many ways is India. As in, China by now has sort of entered the European level climate middle class globally, if you will. So on the one hand, they have sort of middle of the road emissions, right? Not as high as in the US, not as low as they could be. So 8-10 tons per capita. And at the same time, yes, China actually does have fairly ambitious, again, not ambitious enough, but fairly ambitious domestic climate policy targets, right? And it's not so much just sort of the long-term net zero 2060 target. That's important too. But much more importantly, it's what's in the 14th five-year plan, what's in the current five-year plan and the next one. And the immediate prospect of peaking emissions. So it used to be that the goal was basically, or it still is the goal, I think, peaking emissions by 2030, peaking domestic emissions in China by 2030. Well, the way things are going, it looks like China is peaking its emissions by 2025, right? I mean, it still means that emissions are currently rising, and that is a problem, right? In the US, in Europe, they're already going down. But, well, China, of course, started from a much lower level, right? And because of its policies, because of the rapid deployment of renewables, rapid urbanization, by the way, which also contributes positively here, relatively speaking, right? If everyone gets increasingly wealthier, it's a much better to be in the city where emissions are lower per capita than to single family homes in the suburbs, basically, as the big climate pariah. So yeah, China seems to be peaking its emissions by 2025, following current trajectories, and that is good, right? It's not in many ways. It might not be good enough. It's not good enough, right? We are still warming the planet as we speak, but it's fantastic news, especially relative to where projections were relatively recently, where it was a reach goal for China to peak its emissions by 2030, and suddenly a peak by 2025 is well within their reach.
Awesome. We're now reaching the near end of this amazing interview, and I'd like to ask, let's say, advice from you to our listeners. So I have two questions. One is, what's your advice to future and aspiring climate environmental economists? What should they learn from, let's say, your approach to doing research as they try to progress in the early stages of their career?
Well, first of all, congrats. You've chosen the right field. This is a pretty exciting area to be in, largely because a lot is happening, right? So, we spoke about negative climate tipping points and so on. Okay, there are positive socioeconomic tipping points all around, right? So the clean energy revolution is only accelerating as we speak. And yes, it takes a lot of brain power and a lot more, initiative, if you will, to accelerate it even further, right, and push things further in the right direction. So, first point, welcome. Now, second, I guess, this is sort of a broad point about research in general. I would say, very broadly speaking, there are hammer people and there are nail people. There are people who focus on the hammer, on the tool. And in many ways, it's the more traditional way in academia, right? You develop a tool, some fancy econometric technique during your PhD. You publish a few papers showing how important and valuable your tool is. You get tenure based on your tool, and eventually you win the prize, right? The Nobel Prize based on this awesome tool you developed in your 20s, right? Okay, cool. Nothing wrong with that, right? But as a climate economist or someone focused on the nail, the topic, climate, right? You are not following this traditional path in many ways, right? You are not developing this one tool, the hammer, and then you go around for the rest of your career and, you don't care about the topic. You don't care which nail you hit. You just, you apply it to whichever data set you can find. And in many ways, well, again, that's the more traditional thing to do in academia. As a climate economist, in many ways, you're defining yourself by the nail. You're defining yourself by the topic. And maybe the one piece of advice is that's an okay thing. That's a good thing, right? The prior generation of academics, right, may not have looked at the world this way. They define themselves by discipline, right? They're an econometrician, a labor economist, a public economist, and so on. A climate economist says, well, let me borrow from each of these disciplines. Let me not care about what the hammer is. Let me develop the hammer from scratch when I need one. Let me not define myself by the tool, but I will borrow, I will develop, I will apply whichever tool is necessary in order to answer the question. And that's a different way of looking at the world. I think it's an important way, it's a necessary way, and it's increasingly a way to, frankly, get ahead in academia as well, right? Because it's increasingly accepted to basically define yourself by, oh, wow, I care about this topic. I know a lot about this topic. I would like to know even more about this topic, so I collaborate, right? Okay, I mentioned before this 10,000 word essay with a historian, right? I don't think, I don't know whether I will ever again collaborate with a historian on a 10,000 word essay, right? It's certainly a very, very different approach to research than from what an economist, an econometrician, and so on would do. Well, for something like the green moral hazard story, I'd like to think that it's very much appropriate and important and crucial to look to, in this case, history as a discipline and say, let's shine a light on this particular nail by using that particular hammer that, my co-author is a specialist in, I am not. But, well, that's when actually, I guess when you go to gwagner.com/team, which is sort of shortcut, right, for all my collaborators, there is this is not going to sound silly, but I don't actually know how many, but it is many, many, many. It might be 100 or more by now, collaborators. Often, in many ways, in sort of one-off exercises, sometimes 2 or 3 papers that came out of it, but very different hammers applied to this particular nail, a nail being climate, energy, environmental economics.
That's a really good answer, and I really like it. Last question. What's your advice to the students that you teach at Columbia who want to become, from a more practical standpoint, the next climate investors, entrepreneurs, or policymakers? I saw you had a paper on the SBB collapse and its implications on clean tech, but yeah, what's your advice to them?
Well, here's the exciting thing. So I'm completely new here. I came to Columbia Business School a year ago. I taught my very first class as a full-time faculty here in this past spring. And I can tell you, so I taught a class of 75 students, and there was a wait list initially of like a couple hundred students. So every MBA class has 800 people. So 1,600 total, and something like half of them are interested in, want to actively take classes on climate. Right? That's exciting. That is really exciting. No. So first of all, it makes me feel good about, my measly life, right? Like, wow, cool. Like I'm popular, right? Like nobody knows who I am, and they stand in line to take my class, right? Cool. No, but more importantly, right? It just shows that like climate is not some tangential issue, right? Climate is not this thing that you check the box, right? Like you check the ESG box, right? Like, yeah, let's do that too. If you can afford to think about it, let's do that too, right? Like let's worry about checking the social responsibility box, right? No, not at all. It is core. It is a core theme of, look, if you care about financial risk, you better care about climate risk. You better know about climate risk, right? If you care about finance in general, right? Like if you see yourself as a VC investor, right, a venture capital, climate, clean tech is one of the more exciting spaces you can be in. If you are interested in private equity, climate is one of the more exciting spaces you can be in. If you're interested in consulting, climate is one of the more exciting spaces to be in. And, in this case, students voting with their feet, right? It is obvious that that is the case. So, yes, in many ways, the short piece of advice is, again, welcome, right? This is an important area, an important field, an important nail to focus on, regardless of what you think your hammer is. Climate is not this tangential thing. It is core, it's front and center. Climate risk is financial risk. And as trite as it sounds, but risk is equal to opportunity, right? When you say, oh, this clean transition is going to cost us trillions, yeah, that's trillions of investments. And, don't take it from me, but right, when BlackRock says currently 25% of our investments are net zero oriented, and by the end of the decade, we expect 3 times as many, 75% of our investments to be net zero oriented, right? Well, that's both forecast and target. And it is basically saying that this is how the world is going. So join us.
Amazing response. I should applaud, but it won't be good for the mic. But yeah, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate this interview and sharing all your personal and professional insights. I look forward to your future work on G. Wagner or your next books. Have a great you and your family and your colleagues in New York.
Thank you. This was fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Climate Finance Podcast. For future episodes, please join our mailing list on www.climatefinance.xyz. I repeat, www.climatefinance.xyz. See you at the next episode.